Nowadays, we live under corporate capitalism, in which our entire economic system revolves around these gigantic corporations. Now, we often imagine corporations to be single things, but in reality, a corporation is actually a whole conglomeration of different parties that come together under a single name. In this video, I'm going to show you a simplified model of corporations using Lego, and then I'm going to use that to show you how to think about corporate capitalism more generally. So in the 1980s, it was very fashionable to make this distinction between states and markets, as if there was this fundamental antagonism between these two things. But in reality, there's actually no such thing as large-scale capitalism without large-scale nation-states. It's pretty damn obvious that the world's most powerful corporations also happen to reside in the world's most powerful states. So in many ways, corporate and state power operate as a symbiotic unit. When you step out into the economy, you're not stepping out into a lawless void. You're stepping into a state-underpinned system with private property rights, money systems, and so on. In Lego terms, we can imagine all those things as forming this green base plate. Let's imagine this base plate as representing state institutions with military and law courts, CIA agents, and so on. This is the foundation that corporations will be built upon. Now, in the beginning of humanity, there was no such thing as a corporation. You'd have groups of people who might act together, and they might give their group a name, but nobody was under the illusion that this existed separately from the underlying people that formed it. Modern laws of incorporation, however, sever this connection. Corporations are creatures of law. They actually have artificial legal personhood, which means they get to be seen as a person in themselves. In a legal sense, they exist independently of the people that activate them, i.e. the people who work for them or direct them. If you want to understand corporate personhood, think about those news items that say things like Pfizer releases new dieting pills, or Microsoft starts a new AI unit, or BP invests in Turkmenistan. All of those statements are presenting this legal entity as having some kind of personhood in itself. It is spoken of as if it were a big giant walking around doing stuff. At the core of corporate capitalism, then, are these hollow shells, empty legal vessels with no soul, which act as the center points around which all the human players will gather. Let's represent this hollow center. So to be able to act in the world, this hollow shell needs a bank account, but that account will initially be empty. What we call capitalization is a process whereby the empty corporate vessel's account is charged up with money, a bit like charging up an empty battery. And the financial sector is where we go for that. Now, the mainstream financial sector is largely constituted by players like commercial banks, investment banks, and big mega funds like pension funds, insurance funds, sovereign wealth funds, hedge funds, private equity funds, and venture capital funds, all of which operate within this multi-layered monetary system underpinned by central banks. Check out this video here if you want to see more about that. One basic role of the big funds is to pool the money of various smaller players, such as pensioners, for example, and one of the basic roles of the investment banks is then to corral these funds into capitalizing corporations. When doing this, the big funds can take on two basic personas. On the one hand, they can be equity investors, or what we call shareholders. On the other hand, they can be debt investors, or what we call creditors. Shareholders, or equity investors, are institutions and people who will give money to the corporate shell in exchange for an ownership stake in it, a share that will enable them to claim a slice of its profits in future. If the company does well, they'll do well. If it does badly, they'll do badly. Additional financing, though, can come from these creditors, or debt investors. These are people and institutions that will grant money to the corporate shell in exchange for a contract that entitles them to a fixed stream of future interest payments, regardless of how well the company is doing. If the company's fortunes skyrocket or plummet, the creditor's claim remains constant. Creditors include players like bondholders, but also banks. Banks are quite a complicated topic that kind of require a video of their own because unlike other creditors, they actually have money creation power, i.e. when they're lending, they're actually issuing out new money. That's a more advanced topic for another time. So these two classes of financier give the same thing, money, in exchange for the same thing, a contract for future money. But the terms are slightly different. The creditors demand a fixed amount back in future, while the shareholders get the right to a fluctuating amount. There's a whole field of finance called corporate finance, which is about how do you combine these two different forms of investors, or how do you play them off against each other. For example, shareholders can use creditors to amplify their returns via a property called leverage, while creditors use shareholders as a kind of buffer or cannon fodder to take losses. Regardless, these two types of financier collectively charge up the corporate shell with money. Okay, so the corporate entity has now had its bank balance charged up, but it's a legal entity with no mind, body, or desire, so it's going to need some management before it can start using that money to do stuff in the world. So this is the role of managers in our system. The management team directs a bank account of the corporate entity and can use it to buy assets such as facilities, cars, machines, land, IP rights, data centers, and so on. They're going to be buying those assets from suppliers. Now, suppliers are just other companies with other managers and workers who are outputting goods as inputs into another company. So managers are setting strategy and directing the corporate entity to buy up assets, but it's not like they're going to work the machines or code the software or drive the cars. So another big task for management is to hire workers to do all that stuff. Once they're in that position, the bosses can boss them, getting them to activate the assets. For example, by getting them to run the computers or work the machines in a factory or driving the delivery cars or doing whatever it is that the company actually does. So when you're applying for a job, you're essentially competing with other workers for the right to activate a company's assets. We're used to hearing the story, though, that billionaires, shareholder CEOs, like Jeff Bezos, for example, create jobs. But it's equally true that those jobs create billionaires, because it's not like Jeff Bezos would ever be going out to deliver the parcels himself. And if the parcels aren't delivered, Amazon ain't making any profit at all. Put simply, the shareholders, creditors, and managers literally make nothing unless the assets owned by the corporate entity are actually operated by the workers. Workers, however, get paid relatively small fixed sums, what we call wages and salaries, to operate the assets, and the rest will go to managers and financiers. This is why Jeff Bezos' net wealth goes up by 35 million per day. It's not because he actually does all the work, it's because he owns the shares in the hollow shell that owns the assets that are activated by the Amazon workers. So workers operate these assets to produce products, and the corporate entity then sells those products on to consumers. This is basically where the back end of capitalism meets the front end, where the production side of capitalism meets the consumption side. So the income from selling stuff will get split into different cuts for different parties. Managers get bonuses, creditors get interests, and governments get tax. Well, assuming that the company hasn't done large-scale tax avoidance. This leaves the residual as net profit. The managers then get to decide if that will be paid out as dividends to shareholders or reinvested into further operations. This is the basic corporate capitalist circuit in operation. Each of those players has a particular relationship with each other, and each relationship has its own particular tensions and dynamics. One of the things that happens in our system is this kind of chain reaction battle, where shareholders pressure managers to extract profits, which then makes those managers attempt to drive down wages. So, for example, managers can intimidate their local workers by threatening to outsource to foreign suppliers with foreign workers. Alternatively, they can buy machines from a supplier to replace their own workers. That machine, though, of course, will be made by other workers, but sold from corporate entity to corporate entity at the direction of the managers, who are essentially getting workers to indirectly undermine each other like this. There are various types of bodies that stand between these different players to mediate between them. So, for example, boards mediate the relationship between shareholders and managers. Unions will try to mediate the relationships between workers and managers. Financial regulators will set rules about relationships between companies and financial markets. For example, is management allowed to do insider trading of the company's shares? Labor regulations focus on relationships between companies and workers. For example, is the company allowed to refuse workers paid sick leave? Consumer regulations will deal with relationships between the corporate entity and customers. For example, should food products have to have a list of ingredients? Now, I've just showed you the interlocking parts of a single corporation. But of course, corporations can interact with each other via that section we call suppliers. Suppliers are just other companies with their own financiers, managers, and workers. So think about the outputs of one company as being the inputs to another company via that supplier section. Companies often end up locked together like this in complex formations. All these supply chains can double over each other and get entangled. So for example, a car company might input plastics from a plastics company, which inputs petroleum from an oil refining company, which inputs both cars and plastics outputted by the previous two companies. What we call corporate capitalism capitalism is an economic system in which the core of the economic system is a whole entangled conglomeration of all these big corporate players who act as suppliers to each other and who eventually output mass amounts of products to mass amounts of consumers, but who also act as gatekeepers for hundreds of millions of workers who are trying to get jobs in the economy. So in the end, we got this massive system of corporate domination in the middle of our economy, with workers plugging into it and products being outputted to consumers. But if we were to isolate all those common parts into common categories and pull them apart, you could start to see the entire economy as a series of sectors that are interacting with each other, with the financial sector and the managerial sector, and workers connecting in via job markets, and suppliers connecting in via business-to-business markets, and consumers connecting in via consumer markets and pushing money back through the circuit. Remember also that the workers can be putting some of the money they earn towards buying consumer goods, but they can also be reinvesting it back into the financial sector as retail investors. In the end, our economy is a gigantic interdependent mesh, and actually all of us occupy multiple positions within this mesh at different times. You might walk into work in the morning as a worker, but in the evening you turn into a consumer as you walk into a shop to buy stuff that's been produced by other workers during the day. Always remember that this whole system doesn't work unless the workers are activating the assets of the companies. So don't swallow those stories where they say that the managers are quote-unquote giving workers jobs. Remember that the managers themselves and the shareholders and all the financiers get nothing unless the workers do all the work for them. So they're not doing workers a favor by giving the workers a job. They rely upon those workers to do the work, otherwise they're getting no profits. We can explore this picture in later videos, but for now I hope this has been a useful introduction to corporate capitalism for you. Hope you've enjoyed, and I'll see you next time.